Okay, well, good evening, and we're going to start out tonight with that chart that I gave you. It's titled The Outline of the Prophetical Ages. And we're concerned with this because it shows, it has two crossover periods. Now, what that means is the crossover period is when Israel and the church existed side by side. So you could follow all the ages, creation and these are all other prophecies. I mean, they will take a while to do. We may go back and do some of those, but for our purposes, it's going to concern mostly modern Israel. Yeah, I gave them out last week. So. And what it says, from AD 32 to the rapture, there are prophecies dealing with the church's descent into apostasy, side by side with prophecies dealing with Israel. The church age is subdivided into 7 periods, and the Israeli age is subdivided into 3 periods. 2 prophetic lines develop at AD 32. The first crossover period takes place when Israel exists along with the church. This corresponds to the Ephesus period of church history. The great dispersion of the nation of Israel covers the years between when the Romans dissolved the nation until the nation was recreated in 1948. The second crossover period starts in 1948, covering the period between the birth of the modern nation of Israel to the rapture of the church. These two prophetic lines converge back into one at the second coming of the Messiah. And when you look in Revelation and you see these periods concerning the church, it shows the different stages that the church was in at the time. Of course, now it's a blend. It's not strictly that, but that's what you notice about the different letters to the churches in Revelation, what their apostasy looked like, so to speak. And once the first crossover period ended, that was 132. That's when basically Israel was just dissolved as a nation. That was the last revolt. That was the Bar Kokhba revolt. And after that, there's the Great Dispersion is after that, and that's an 1854-year period, and that led up to 1948. Now we are in the second crossover period. Israel exists as a nation, and the church is still here. Now that one's going to end. Once the church is raptured, then it's Israel alone that's going to go under the 7-year tribulation. And what's left after the church leaves is the Laodicea on earth. That's the corrupt church. That's the apostasy. Yes, sir.
I think right there would be a good place to maybe expound a little bit on the replacement theology, because it's important that the church is gone. So,
sure. Basically, what replacement theology is, and this was even promoted, it became really popular in the 70s, late 70s, and into the early 80s, that the church replaced Israel in prophecy. That's not true, because that's what the tribulation is all about. It's about the judgment on Israel. This replacement theology was even back into the Middle Ages. You know, that was part of what the Crusades were about, that the church was going to take Jerusalem and prepare the world for Jesus. Yes, sir.
even some of the great writers back then who were great writers, but there was a weakness on this issue. Matthew Henry. You read Matthew Henry, there's a brilliant commentary. Whenever it references Israel and the prophets, he'll call it church.
Yes. Yes. And like I said, when I noticed it, or heard a lot about it on the TV preachers in the 70s. You know, that brought I don't know if you guys remember Garner Ted Armstrong. He was very popular in California, and I didn't realize it until years later. That's what he was preaching, that the church would replace Israel in prophecy, and of course that's not true. Yeah. But there's a lot of people today that still believe in replacement theology. Lots of people. Yes, most of the big denominational churches believe that. Yes. Okay, and that brings us to that one handout I gave you on Tish B'Av. It says it at the top. And the reason you see that, and you're going to see it in the prophecies that are listed, because even a date has a prophetic quality to it, especially to the Jews. Tish B'Av is basically, it's the 9th of Tishri, a particular day. And it says here about that, we have identified many of the prophecies that were fulfilled on the festivals of Passover and Pentecost, so we can be certain that rituals done on these festivals have embedded prophecy in them. In addition to the 7 festivals, there are certain dates on the Jewish calendar that seem to be prophetic. The 9th of Av is one such date. It varies each year, but always occurs in July or August on our calendar. Both temples were destroyed on the 9th of Av, called Tisha B'Av on the Hebrew calendar. If we examine the date, we will see many prophetical occurrences during the time of the Great Dispersion. And in your chart, it lists those. And we can go through them briefly. The 1453 BC, 12 spies return, and the 40-year wandering in the wilderness begins. That's, of course, Numbers 14, verses 1 through 10, when they brought the bad report. And that was on the 9th of Tishri, or the 9th of Av, Tisha B'Av. And at that time, the Temple of Solomon on that date was desecrated with Asherah poles. And then July 29, 587 BC, the Temple of Solomon was burned by the Babylonians. August 4th, 70 AD, Second Temple was burned by the Romans. The Roman army under Turnus Rufus plowed the site of the temple with salt. Romans began to build the pagan city of Aelia Capitolina on the site of Jerusalem. And of course, when the dispersion occurred, that was August 5th, 132 AD. Bar Kokhba rebellion occurs in which 1 million died. July 14th, 1090 AD, the martyrs of York, 500 Jews died as a result of a mob storming a castle in York, England. July 14th, 1095 AD, First Crusade declared by Pope Urban, 10,000 Jews killed in the first month of the crusade, whole Jewish communities in Rhineland and France totally obliterated. And if you do any reading about the Crusades, it's pretty horrible what they actually did to the Jews. I mean, when they took Jerusalem, the Crusaders were tossing babies up in the air with a sword, and they just wholesale murder of the Jews. And that's back again to replacement theology. They thought the Roman Catholic Church is replacing Israel. July 18, 1290, all Jews expelled from England. August 2nd, 1492 AD, all Jews expelled from Spain, including Columbus. That's when he left on his trip. August 1st, 1914, World War I is declared on the 9th of Av, and that was August 1st. August 1st, 1914, again, Russia mobilized for World War I and launched persecutions against the Jews in Eastern Russia. And another interesting side note about that, this involves, once the dispersion began, the Jews went into mysticism. You've heard of the Kabbalah. Well, they were incorporating magic into their faith because they had no more temple. They had to come up with a new way to worship. They had no altar to do sacrifices on, so they did. They came up with basically New Judaism. And it just wasn't a single one. There were many branches to it. And the interesting thing in Russia, there was a group called the Karaites. Now, the Karaites were Jews, but they believed in Moses and the prophets only. They said the Mishnah and all that commentary, the oral tradition, they said was garbage. So we want no part of that. Now, the funny thing is, when the czars were persecuting the Jews, They persecuted all the Jews except the Karaites. Don't know why. Apparently, it was God's supernatural protection because they stuck to Moses and the prophets, and they didn't deviate from that. So they were spared. July 10th, 1942. On July 10th, 1942, the Germans began a systematic liquidation of the Warsaw Ghetto, deporting Jews to extermination camps at the rate of 6,000 to 10,000 per day. Deportation started on Ave 9th, and by autumn there were only 40,000 Jews left in Warsaw. And the next one has a question, Antichrist born. And that says because the Jewish tradition says a Messiah would be born on Tish B'Av, and he would build the third temple. The true Messiah, Jesus, was not born on Av 9th, but probably on Tishri 15th. And that, for us, would be sometime in September. That was during the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, the reference for all of these, and these are prophetic dates, if you look at this reference, it's called the Ta'anit, and that's T-A slash and A-N-I-T. That's not on your paper. But what that is a commentary on the Torah. And it has the Mishnah and another commentary that's part of the Mishnah that's called the Gemara. And it talks about the things that it predicts on the 9th of Av, or the things that have happened also on the 9th of Av, which confirms that it is a prophetic date. And nothing good happens on that date. So, okay. Anybody have any questions about that so far? Ta'anit. You need a spelling again. T-A, like an apostrophe, and then A-N-I-T. And the specific one that applies to most of these is 29a is the verse, the chapter and verse of it. If you look on your computer, just put that in there, it'll bring it up. And it has it in Hebrew, and then it has in English what the Mishnah says about it, and what the Gemara says about it. T-A apostrophe and then A-N-I-T. And the chapter's 29a. Okay, anybody else? If not, we will start with the next handout you have. It's titled Modern Israel. And what I'll do is I'll go through each one of these. You have the prophecy and the reference number. So I'll have a little commentary on, not necessarily a lot. And starting with the date 1948, that was the rebirth of Israel. And this is also the second crossover period, which we are in right now. Yeah, that's your second handout. You got two of them. The first one was oh, I'm telling you the wrong one. The second one you got is the Great Dispersion, right? I skipped a marker. I'm sorry. The Great Dispersion. I'm jumping the gun. Thursday before last, we actually did the first one. I gave you a preview on that. It says the pagan temple of Serapis was destroyed. And that is actually a secular writing. Socrates wrote about that. And again, what he wrote, it says, when the temple of Serapis was torn down and laid bare, there were found in it, engraven on stones, certain characters which they call hieroglyphics, having the form of crosses. After the hieroglyphics had been deciphered, it was found that it contained a prediction that when the cross should appear, for this was life to come, the temple of Serapis would be destroyed, A very great number of pagans embraced Christianity and, confessing their sins, were baptized. And that is from Socrates' Ecclesiastical History, and it gives a chapter and verse. It's chapter 9, verse 17 on that. Now, the question is how was he able to accurately write about that? Apparently, when Joseph was there, he knew that the Egyptians had a habit of ancestor worship, or their previous leaders, their worship. And he knew at some time in the future they were probably going to do that to him. Now, Serapis was probably another name for Joseph. So he had actually made a library, it was what it was. And he wrote about these things. But of course, once they started worshiping, it became the temple of Serapis. And then apparently Socrates found these writings, and he wrote this down that Christianity would start, and people did so believed it that they became Christians. All right, the next one. Roman Empire will divide into parts, Eastern and Western. Now you'll find that in Daniel 2. And the other source is called the Esdras Apocalypse 2, or chapter 11, Esdras Apocalypse chapter 11. So if you can actually get that book online also if you want to. Just you can look up Esdras Apocalypse and you can get that. Again, Ken Johnson actually wrote a book. I do have that book also, but we're not going to go all through it. I'm just using that as a reference because it's not part of Scripture. It contains what are thought to be writings of the church fathers. So and that part is accurate. And these particular chapters that he's writing on in Esdras 11 and 12 have to do with the end times, and they seem to be in line with what the church fathers taught. So the assumption is that yes, these are writings of the church fathers. The rest of it is questionable. But to give him some credit, or give the writer some credit, that it doesn't really conflict with doctrine, and the rest is just inaccurate. It can't be trusted. It might have been corrupted. The Jews that altered the Septuagint in their Bible may have had something to do with that corruption. So you can't really depend on it. But like you can, since it is referenced in the Bible as reading, it's good for history. It's good just to know. So it helps you to differentiate between what is and what isn't true. Now, the division of the old Roman Empire, back to the prophecy, AD 395. Daniel recorded that the Roman Empire would first be divided, then in the last days revived in the form of 10 nations. And we're going to cover that later in this section a little more thoroughly. Daniel, specifically Daniel's chapter 2, verse 41. It says, "In that you saw the feet and toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, it will be a divided kingdom, but it will have in it toughness of iron, inasmuch as you saw the iron mixed with common clay." The next one, Edom's desolation. Edom/Petra will become desolate. And that is in Isaiah chapter 34, verse 5 and verses 8 through 10. Now it says about that, the remnant, before I read it, the remnant of Esau left Edom and migrated to Israel shortly after Babylon captured Judah. It is thought that these Edomite descendants are the modern Palestinians. And again, I have another prophecy book about Psalm 83 war, and it does reference that. After the migration, the Nabateans conquered Edom and Petra. By AD 625, all the rivers and streams had completely dried up, and Petra, the capital of ancient Edom, became a ghost town. About this time, Islam was born. Now, Isaiah 34, verse 5, and then verses 8 through 10, it says, "For my sword is satiated in heaven. Behold, it shall descend for judgment upon Edom. For the Lord has a day of vengeance, a year of recompense for the cause of Zion. Its streams will be turned into pitch, and its loose earth into brimstone, and its land will become burning pitch. It will not be quenched night or day. Its smoke will go up forever from generation to generation. It will be desolate. None will pass through it forever and ever. On the next one. The eastern gate sealed. Ezekiel, or this AD 1517, Eastern Gate sealed. Ezekiel 40 through 48 describes the future millennial temple in great detail. Although the second temple was destroyed, the outer structure, including the western wall and the eastern gate, has remained. Ezekiel writes that sometime before the millennial temple is built, which will be during the church age, the eastern gate would be sealed up because the glory of the Lord or the Messiah had entered through it. This refers to the triumphal entry of Jesus in AD 32. And reading from Ezekiel 44, verses 1 and 2 says, "Then he brought me back by way of the outer gate of the sanctuary, which faces the east, and it was shut. The Lord said to me, this gate shall be shut. It shall not be opened, and no one shall enter by it, for the Lord God of Israel has entered by it. Therefore it shall be shut." Now, when this gate was sealed, again, it was AD 1517. Suleiman the Magnificent, he was the 10th Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, and he annexed Jerusalem. He commanded the city with its walls to be rebuilt, and in the process, the eastern gate was sealed. No official record explains why he did this, but one legend states the Jews believed that Ezekiel 44, 1 and 2 referred to the Messiah coming from the east to conquer all non-Jews and rebuild the kingdom of David. The Christians of his time stated Jesus would return to the Mount of Olives based on Acts chapter 1, verses 10 through 12, and Zechariah 14. Then come through the eastern gate based on Ezekiel, we just read 44, 1 and 2. So Suleiman ordered the eastern gate closed and a cemetery put right outside the gate, believing no Jewish holy man would walk through a Muslim cemetery. He also did this to prevent anyone from using these beliefs to start an uprising. So he knew Jewish law. So obviously, even today, you're not supposed to touch a rabbi because it makes him unclean. And if it's during Sabbath, you can't do Sabbath services. So Suleiman knew that touching dead bodies or walking through a pagan cemetery would make a holy man unclean. So he tried to prevent the Messiah from coming back. So it could be. I don't know for sure. So. It says the gate continued untouched until December 9th, 1917. On that day, with British General Allenby's army approaching, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem ordered to open the Jerusalem gate sealed and sealed the eastern gate for defensive purposes. As workmen picked up their sledgehammers, Allenby's planes flew over the city, dropping leaflets ordering the Arabs to flee. Since there was a Muslim legend that said they would never leave the city until a prophet of Allah had told them to, and since Allenby in Arabic can be translated the prophet of Allah, the workers put down their hammers and left along with the Muslim soldiers. Jerusalem came into British hands without a single shot being fired in the holy city. This was just 1 month after the Balfour Declaration was signed, giving the Jews the right to their ancient homeland. When God seals a gate, it stays sealed, no matter what. Then in 1967, Jordan's King Hussein wanted to unseal the eastern gate for Muslim pilgrimages to the El Aqsa Mosque. The opening of the gate was set to commence on June 5th, 1967. Guess what happened on that day? The 6-day war started. At the end of the war, the Jews controlled the old city and would not let the gate be opened until the advent of the Messiah. Today, the gate remains sealed and will continue to be sealed until the return of Jesus the Messiah. Okay. The next one is about Greece, Syria, Egypt, and Turkey. Alexander the Great's empire broke into these 4 nations: Greece, Syria, Egypt, and Turkey. Turkey created the great Ottoman Empire and conquered Syria, Egypt, Greece, and many other nations. Since Daniel states in the latter days, when the Antichrist rises to power, these 4 nations will be ruling. The Ottoman Empire had to be dissolved and these ancient nations recreated and given their independence. The Ottoman Empire came to an end in World War I. After World War I, Syria, Egypt, and Turkey were recreated by the Leagues of Nations. Egypt became autonomous in 1922, Turkey in 1929, and Syria in 1944. Greece was conquered by the Ottoman Empire in AD 1453, but managed to break away, gaining its independence in 1829. Over the next century, it regained its former islands, but was conquered again by the Nazis in World War II. After World War II, the Nationals and Communists waged a civil war. By 1975, a democratic government was firmly in place and continues to this day. Now, this is an interpretation from Daniel chapter 8, verses 22 and 23 reads, "The broken horn and the 4 horns that arose in its place represent 4 kingdoms, which will arise from his nation, although not with his power. In the latter period of their rule, when transgressors have run their course, a king will arise, insolent and skilled in intrigue." So first, these nations had to be recreated, which they were. And what this prophecy is saying, a king, which is the Antichrist, will arise, insolent and skilled in intrigue, and conquer them. But they had to become independent. That's the whole prophecy. These nations were there, disappeared, and they had to come back again. The next one, Jews buy back their land. And this is actually prophecy from Jeremiah, chapter 32, verse 44. It says, Jeremiah prophesied that in the last times, before Israel would become a nation, Jews would begin to return to the land and buy back parcels of it. These purchases began to occur in the late 1880s and continued through 1948. And the scripture reads, Jeremiah 32:44, "Men will buy fields for money, sign and seal deeds, and call in witnesses in the land of Benjamin, in the environs of Jerusalem, in the cities of Judah, in the cities of the hill country, in the cities of the lowland, and the cities of Negev. For I will restore their fortunes, declares the Lord." So obviously, that's another fulfillment of the prophecy. Now, the Balfour Declaration, I think most of us have heard about that. Now, Isaiah states Tarshish, which is identified as Britain, would be the first to bring Jews back to their land. After World War I, Great Britain was given the mandate by the League of Nations to create a homeland for the Jews. They began to carve out a Jewish homeland, but before it was finished, they divided the land into 2 main parts, one for Israel and the other for the Palestinians. The Palestinian partition was called Transjordan. The division of the land of Israel always angers God, and Great Britain lost her empire as a result. and that's from Isaiah chapter 60, verses 9 and 10, which reads, "Surely the coastlands will wait for me, and the ships of Tarshish will come first to bring your sons from afar, their silver and their gold with them, for the name of the Lord your God and for the Holy One of Israel, because he has glorified you. Foreigners will build up your walls, and their kings will minister to you. For in my wrath I struck you, and in my favor I have compassion on you." And another scripture that's part of that is Joel chapter 3, verses 1 and 2, which reads, "For behold, in those days and at that time when I restore the fortunes of Judah and Jerusalem, I will gather all the nations and bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat. Then I will enter into judgment with them there on behalf of my people and my inheritance Israel, whom they have scattered among the nations, and they have divided up my land." And this would actually be an entire another study. When God talks about dividing up the land, you do not want to do that. You don't want to be part of that, because bad things happen. There's a whole, like I said, there's a whole book called Eye for Eye on that, and it talks about our recent presidents or nations that have attempted to divide up Israel, and things that have occurred on the dates that they intended to do it. And do you have a question, Warner?
Well, you're hearing now Muslims and their supporters saying from the river to the sea. And the ironic thing is when you ask them, a lot of Americans who are saying that, what river?
Yep, they don't know.
What's interesting is, in God's description, the Jordan was not a river.
No, it was the Euphrates.
It was the Euphrates. So when God said that land belongs to Israel, to Abraham's children, it was from the river Egypt to the Euphrates.
Exactly.
So
Exactly.
Jordan belongs to Israel.
But and then the interesting thing about this, the Palestinians, they carved them out a homeland, which was actually larger than what they give Israel. But what had happened in 1948, the Arab nations surrounding the area told the Palestinians, "No, go ahead and move out of your houses. We're gonna knock off Israel, then you can just move right back." Well, they went into Jordan, but of course they lost the war. When they lost the war, the Jordanians didn't want the Palestinians there, so they kept them as refugees because. Yep. No.
And it's not because they're trying to cause Israel problems. They're afraid of the Palestinians.
Yes. King Hussein was afraid that they would overthrow his country, so he did not want them there at all. And he knew Arafat was a troublemaker. Arafat wasn't even a Palestinian. He was an Egyptian. But he led the Palestinians. But we should have learned our lesson about this. One thing that I do remember reading about was when George Bush was encouraging Israel to give back the West Bank. Well, when he proposed that, I think it was almost exactly, if less than a week later, or was it the next day, Hurricane Katrina.
Was it a hurricane or was it a great storm?
It was Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans.
Okay, the perfect storm was the one that hit George Bush. And you have to understand that you have to go to Kennebunkport. From the border to the land where Kennebunkport is
Yep.
a cliff about 40 or 50 feet. It wiped out his first floor.
Yep. I think that was George Bush the first, not George W. I'm talking about George W. Yep.
And HW, when he said that we need to divide the land,
Yes.
that's when the perfect storm, they made the movie about it.
Yes.
That's when the perfect storm hit. It came across that cliff and wiped out the first floor of Kennebunkport, of his mansion.
And if you think about Katrina, it was kind of a double judgment, because on that day also, or during that week, that was Gay Pride Week in New Orleans. So you don't want to mess with mess with Israeli land at all. If you're not going to, I think Donald Trump actually got a blessing because he made Jerusalem the capital. That's where he put our embassy. So God blessed us through that because, our economy turned great and the rest of the world respected us. So, but now, not so much. Biden is pushing for a Palestinian state. So, does it look? Yes. Yeah. And in the first place, I wouldn't want to threaten Israel with anything because they're more powerful than most nations realize, or they just ignore it.
But it's not their power that they should fear. It's the power of the one who's behind.
Absolutely. And God calls them in prophecy the fire pot among nations. And he also speaks of exceedingly great army, which I would say Israel has. Now, that's Balfour Declaration. That was in 1917. Next thing is the Holocaust.
The original Balfour gave them all of Israel.
Oh, yes.
And even, I think, if I remember, even into Jordan.
Yes. The original Balfour, and then there was a white paper later, I think, in the early 30s that divided it up more. But the original one included what is Jordan, a big chunk of Syria, the Sinai Peninsula, all of the Sinai Peninsula. Yes, that was the original. Next, the Holocaust. Daniel prophesied the 4 kingdoms that came out of Alexander the Great's empire. Again, that's the 4 to just talk about. Greece, Turkey, Syria, and Egypt would continue to exist and rule in the latter times. This might indicate these 4 nations are part of the 10 nations ruling in the last days. Whether or not they are part of the ruling 10 nations, their rule and rise of the Antichrist occurs after the time when the transgressors have run their course. This probably refers to the persecution of the Jews during the Great Depression, which ended with the greatest persecution up to that time, the Holocaust. To date, this has been the worst catastrophe the Jews have ever faced, including the destruction of the temple in AD 70. We can safely say to the preterists, the tribulation did not occur in AD 70. And this is Daniel 8, chapter 8, verses 22 and 23. The broken horn and the 4 horns that arose in its place represent 4 kingdoms which will rise from his nation, although not with his power. In the latter period of their rule, when transgressors have run their course, a king will arise. And it says, in response to Hitler's Jewish problem, nations like the USA and Britain kept asking Hitler to find a nation that German Jews could move to. At one point during Hitler's reign in Germany, Hitler actually stated he would be willing to sell the Jews to any nation that would pay for them. Since no one took him up on his offer, the extermination camps were open. Yes. And even when Israel was established, the British had the mandate for that region, of course, and they wouldn't let the Jews come back. Even with legal, they wouldn't let them return. They blocked their ships because the Arabs had put so much pressure on them to do so. And part of this is Deuteronomy chapter 28, verses 64 through 68. Moreover, the Lord will scatter you among all peoples from one end of the earth to the other end of the earth, and there you shall serve other gods, wood and stone, which you or your fathers have not known. Among these nations you shall find no rest, and there will be no resting places for the sole of your foot. But there the Lord will give you a trembling heart, failing of eyes, and despair of soul. So your life shall hang in doubt before you, and you will be in dread night and day and have no assurance of your life. In the morning you shall say, would that it were evening, and evening you shall say, would that it were morning, because of the dread of your heart which you dread, and for the sight of your eyes which you will see. The Lord will bring you back to Egypt in ships, by way about which I spoke to you. You will never see it again. And there you will offer yourselves for sale to your enemies as male and female slaves, but there will be no buyer. So when you read things like this in Deuteronomy or in other places in the Old Testament, especially if you're a new believer, they make no sense at all. But when you go back and combine it with history and see what has happened, the lights come on. And it's just amazing. It gives you goosebumps to read this, read the scripture, and then compare it to what had happened at that date. Jeremiah wrote that before God brought Israel back in 1948, he would first fish for them. The fishers were all those groups that tried to get the Jews to go back to their ancient homeland with financial promises and other incentives. This was back in the earlier part of the 20th century. After this time, God would send hunters to force them to go home. This is most likely a reference to the Nazi Holocaust and other European pogroms. And again, this is Jeremiah chapter 16, verses 15 and 16. And it reads, "But as the Lord lives, who brought up the sons of Israel from the land of the north and from all countries where he banished them, for I will restore them to their own land, which I gave to their fathers. Behold, I am going to send for many fishermen, declares the Lord, and they will fish for them. And afterwards I will send for many hunters, and they will hunt them from every mountain and every hill and from the clefts of the rocks." Even today, we still see the hunters and fishers being used by God to cause more and more Jews to return to Israel. About 300,000 reserves. Yep. That's why we were talking before about you thought how long it was going to be before this started coming about. I'm pretty sure it's coming up pretty fast. You know, we're kind of seeing a little bit of a lull, but yep. And they're getting volunteers from America and from other nations. They're getting volunteers that want to join the IDF. Yep. Very, very. And you know, it's God's hand working. And I don't see how anybody can doubt what's going to happen. If they know anything about Scripture or about prophecy, it's unfolding in front of us. Right now, it's happening. Okay. Now, this talks a little bit like what I was telling you about the apocalypse of Esdras. I don't know if I'm going to get into that too much because it's a little bit confusing. Well, it was for me anyway. You might understand it better than I do. There are some things that are apparent, but it talks about it. This is titled "The Scroll." As we will detail in this section, probably not going to do it, or I'll do that later. The apostasy of the church. First century cults created fake documents to further their cause. Sometimes they took real history and real words of knowledge from ancient church fathers and combined them with their heretical teachings. The apocalypse of Esdras appears to be that sort of hybrid work, which reports to be visions from the same Ezra who authored the biblical book of Ezra. The apocalypse of Esdras has existed from the 2nd century AD and was included in the original 1611 King James Version Bible. It has never been included in the Roman Catholic or Eastern Orthodox Apocrypha. It does contain errors and contradictions, which is why it was eventually removed from the 1611 King James Version. The Anglicans probably included it in the 1611 King James Version because it was so anti-Roman Catholic in doctrine. This is also why it will never be a Roman Catholic or in an Eastern Orthodox Bible. The Apocalypse of Esdras 11, chapters 11 through 12, contains a prophecy dealing with the rise of papal Rome and Eastern Orthodoxy, which predicts their doom. Therefore, I conclude that the majority of the work is fake, but the section on the prophecy of the three-headed eagle is probably a word of knowledge from an ancient church father. It fits with what occurred in history up to AD 1945 and the premillennial and pre-tribulational biblical teachings. Now, the prophecy that it is coming from Esdras it says it's divided into 6 sections. The fall of Rome in AD 476, the fall of Constantinople in 476, rise and fall of papal Rome from 476 to 1523, and the rise and fall of the Holy Roman Empire from 800 to 1917, and the rise of Russia in 1945, and the end times rapture, Great Tribulation, and Second Coming. Now, we're about done for tonight anyway. Now, I can go ahead if you are interested, if you want me to get that prophecy for next Thursday. I could talk about a little bit about Esdras' prophecies. It is interesting, and it looks like it probably was a writing of a church father because it's pretty much spot on. But I can do that next Thursday. I can give a Reader's Digest version, and then we can go on to the rest of the prophecies on modern Israel. So if you're interested in doing that, I will go ahead and do that about Esdras, just so you have an idea of the background. And it may interest you to go ahead and get that book, because it is a good book. It's broken down very well. Dr. Ken Johnson wrote that also, and it is online. Apocalypse of Esdras, E-S-D-R-A-S. All right? Yes, sir. Yeah. Apocalypse of Esdras. No, the most of it isn't, but like he says here, it's kind of a hybrid work, that some of it may have, and in particular, he's saying that if any of it does, it probably most likely is the chapters 11 and 12 talking about the Holy Roman Empire and even Germany and Russia. Yeah. Yeah. Yep. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. And I think God sorts these things out because he doesn't want us chasing the rabbits. You know, the main thing of the Bible is about Jesus, and it's about the gospel, and that's what he wants us to keep our focus on. So, and that's one of my thoughts about in Genesis, of course, between the first and second verse. He put it as it is, so, you know, if it came down to us as the earth became null and void, you're going to have people start looking there, saying, well, what happened? What happened? What happened? That's just human nature to do that. As it is, you know, it more or less says, this is what happened. We're going to go on, and we're going to get to the truth and the real writing that I'm giving you. So it's interesting speculation. We'll know for sure when we get there, won't we? Probably instantaneously. So, yeah, and we won't care. We'll have eternity, so it'd be something interesting to see. You know? So, anybody else? Any questions? I'll go into a little bit on the Apocalypse of Esdras, what it talks about the rise and fall of the empires. Not an in-depth thing. Like, I don't want to distract us. You know, I can chase that rabbit a little bit just so if you're interested. So. Ken Johnson, Dr. Ken Johnson. And if you just type that into Amazon, all his stuff will pop up. That's the best way to do it.